The Age of Uncertainty podcast by Nigel Baker.
Hiya, welcome to the latest episode of the Age of Uncertainty podcast. This one is all about Agile-ish. I think I called it when half-baked becomes half-broken, but really it's about when half-baked becomes totally broken. Now, if you don't know me, I've been on the Agile scene a long time. I've been doing this nearly 30 years and been in Agile nearly 25 years. I was one of the first Agile coaches, one of the first certified Scrum trainers, and I've been talking about this stuff for a long, long time. So there is a huge danger that this episode is going to be a huge amount of overthinking. Right, so we often talk these days about making things snackable. Well, some of this stuff could be pretty obtuse and indigestible. So what I've tried to do is break it down to a few easier bite-sized chunks and work our way through those. Now, the entire idea behind this presentation has been accused of being what we call bike shedding. Now, if you don't know what bike shedding is when you have a problem so complex and difficult that people tend to focus on the easy or trivial aspects of it. I.e., you're designing a new hospital and everyone talks about the colour of the bike shed. So the bike shed in this situation was actually the use of the word ceremony in Scrum. Was it part of Scrum language? Is it part of Scrum language? And of course, it never has been and never will be. But some people thought that was just a trivial thing. Who cares if we call it an event or a ceremony or a ritual? And I thought, well, I care. One, because I'm an ex-software developer, so obviously I care about what's technically correct, because we all know what's technically correct is the best kind of correct. But also the implication, using a word like ceremony could easily lead us towards thinking of these things as being dull, dry, ritualized, performative, rather than being like an event, like a party, where they're supposed to be interesting, different and engaging every time. So that small word could have a big influence. So let's get off my soapbox and actually get us onto the conversation in hand and how this thing connects. So we're going to split today into 4 sections. We're going to discuss the problem. What is it? Who's suffering from it? Why is it happening? We're then going to have a brief introduction to the Nigel scale, a method I invented many years ago and used to help people understand the difference in Scrum between good and core. Then we're going to look at Nigel graphing, which is a technique I invented a few years ago to visualize those differences and how they change over time. And then finally, with the last few moments in this session, we're going to look at my new thing, this experiment I've been running. And I've done it with a few people. I'd like you to have a think about it today. So let's first start with the problem. What problem are we trying to solve? Well, at the moment, I don't know if you know this, but Agile is dead. Agile social media has told me this. Lots of very loud people with lots of opinions have been sharing this across social media. And frankly, I do find that a rather tiring thing to say. Agile is dead. It's like saying, I don't know, freedom is dead. Is freedom dead? Gosh, I hope not. In fact, the only thing more annoying to me than saying Agile is dead are people who then post, Agile is not dead, it's alive. And I think, well, it is struggling a bit. And the only people who annoy me more than the ones who say Agile is dead and Agile is alive are the people who say, but Agile's something in between the two. It's like it's undead, it's a zombie. And I'm afraid I've been guilty of doing that as well. And so there is an issue out there in the industry that Agile is under a lot of pressure. But when we say Agile, what do we actually mean? Well, here I've got a lovely quote of agility. I really like this quote. Agile is incremental, iterative, empirical and empowered product development. Incremental requires strong technical ability. Empirical requires close customer and stakeholder interaction. Iterative requires us to learn from the first 2. And empowered is freeing us to do all of the above. Now, who first came up with this? Well, yes, it's me, Nigel Baker. Yes, I am quoting myself. Yes, that is embarrassing, but not embarrassing enough to stop me doing it. Now, the reason I'm quoting myself is because when we talk about this half-formed agility out there in industry, we're seeing incrementalism, people of strong technical ability. We're seeing some empiricism still, people engaging with customers and stakeholders. We're seeing some iterativeness, not enough, but some. But the real killer, the thing that's been crushed, is empowerment. We're seeing far too much of the old school leaders telling the lead. The return of pretty much techno-feudalism, where people try to hire these superheroes to lead and then assume everyone else is a minion just to follow behind. So we are currently living in this Agile-ish world. But is that such a bad thing? You know, there's no such thing as perfect. I've never seen a perfect agile organization. There's this famous Kurt Vonnegut quote, if you can do a half-assed job of anything, you're a one-eyed man in the kingdom of the blind. So perhaps Agile-ish is good enough. Perhaps that's what's going to take us forward. Yet, do you remember the term I used earlier on? Half-baked. That's interesting, isn't it? Because if you half-bake something, you get salmonella. So, being half-assed may be good enough, but being half-baked could get you fired. Now, Scrum has actually tried to handle this before. I don't know if you've noticed this phrase in the Scrum Guide.
Scrum is free and offered in this guide. The Scrum framework, as outlined herein, is immutable. While implementing only parts of Scrum is possible, the result is not Scrum. Scrum exists only in its entirety and functions well as a container for other techniques, methodologies, and practices.
Now, I'm not a huge fan of the Scrum Guide. I think it's got some benefits and some drawbacks. But this phrase is really interesting. It really triggers a lot of agile people in the industry. Some people thought that this phrasing was somehow a way of claiming that Scrum was perfect and couldn't be improved. Some people thought of it as claiming that Scrum is somehow anti-agile, it cannot be changed. When in fact, the entire point of this phrase in the Scrum Guide was to basically be a government health warning, or more precisely a Ken Schwaber health warning, saying, look, this product can be dangerous if misused. If you use it in the wrong way, if you take things out of it that support certain ideas or concepts, the result that's left, we do not take any credit for, but we will not take any blame for. So look at this LinkedIn post I found the other day. I've taken the guy's name off because it's a good person saying good things, but it's talking here about the future of Agile. What if Agile roles were designed today? They weren't like the Scrum Guide, where your Scrum Master is deploying code, or your product owner is also a project manager, or your team are across 3 continents and all remote and don't speak to each other. And I was thinking when reading this, well, if that's the future sucks. Some of those things aren't great, like having a Scrum Master coding isn't the worst thing in the world, but what about the rest of their job? But do you really want your product owner acting like a project manager, focusing on delivering all the content rather than value delivery? Do you really want to suggest teams spread across multiple continents, never communicating with each other? That's just a bad idea. And so that brings me on to my idea from all those years ago. I think I first came up with it in 2009, the Nigel scale. Now, this scale was invented for one simple reason. What I was trying to do was come up with a language to explain there are things that are fundamental in our world, things that are optional in the world of Scrum, things that are contextual, and there are things that are bad ideas in the world of Scrum. It was as simple as that, a 3-point model to try and explain this difference between these fundamentals, these optionals, and these bad ideas. So Nigel Scale 1 is this idea of core, the fundamental irreducible core. Now, this is what is supposed to be in the Scrum Guide. The Scrum Guide is supposed to capture this fundamental scaffolding that if you bend or break it, things go horribly wrong. So I'll give an example of a core practice in a different industry. In the world of surgery, a surgeon disinfects their hands before surgery. This is not an option. This is not a life choice. The surgeon doesn't really get to have an opinion on this. You know what? As a surgeon, I don't believe in bacteria, so I don't need to wash my hands. But shut up. There are certain things that you have to do to get success. Now, That is supposed to be the Scrum Guide, and that's why the Scrum Guide's quite light, because there's not much of that in the world of product development. Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your personal choices, most of the decisions we have to make are around Nigel Scale 2 things. Now, what's Nigel Scale 2? These are the things that Scrum doesn't officially care about. These are those weird and wonderful things that fall into the world of good practice. This is the world of context is king, so we have to use our previous experience to help coach organisations to self-organise their own answers to their own complex problems. And then we have Nigel Scale 3. This is the stuff that is not agile, the stuff we avoid. This could just be bad behaviours or bad ideas, or worse still, anti-patterns. Something that looks like a good idea until you get into it, and then you start discovering, oh no, this is terrible. So to have a brief conversation about this, there are common mistakes made that you can use the Nigel Scale to really bottom out. Like an example is things like user stories. A great technique, I'm a huge fan of them, they're not suitable for all contexts. They're actually Nigel Scale 2. A lot of people assume they're part of Scrum, but they're not. And the reason they're not is there could be better practices for your team in your situation. You know, if you're working on a safety critical system, perhaps use cases would be more appropriate. You know, perhaps you're moving fast and breaking things, even the artifice and structure of a user story could be too much. So the idea here is there's lots of flexibility in the stuff we're doing, yet certain things are not flexible. The idea of an empowered, self-organizing team is a fundamental concept in the world of Scrum and hell in the world of Agile. And if that is missing, I think our products will get into trouble. And it doesn't matter if we're Agile or not, because who really cares in the end? It matters if we're successful or not. And I feel those Nigel Scale 1 core things are key hygiene factors to help us get to success compared to some of these other things. So if you take one thing from this presentation, take the Nigel Scale and use it to analyse your workplace and work out what are bad practice, what are good optional practices, and what are core practices. But that isn't the point of this presentation. This is just the first building block on which we're going to build another idea, Nigel graphing. Now, Nigel graphing is an idea that I'm afraid to say that practices don't sit in those lovely Nigel Scale boxes over time. Some practices may start off as a good idea, but over time decay. They lose the value as the team becomes more experienced. And vice versa. There are some practices that are possibly a bad idea on day one, yet as your team gains skill and experience, maturity and finesse, these practices become viable. Okay, so there's this interesting sort of decay or maturity of practice over time. And so what I started to do was to visualize practices over that time period using this. Now, this is, I believe, what's called a BOTG, a behavior over time graph from the world of systems thinking. So you track some behavior over time. And you can see here, I'm tracking the 3 aspects of the Nigel Scale. Nigel Scale 1, 2, 3, core, good, bad. So let's look at a few examples here and see what we can learn. So here's our first example, planning poker, a classic technique popularised in many a Scrum training over the decades. Is it valuable or not? Now, of course, you speak to most people these days, they will talk about planning poker being the equivalent, so passé, the equivalent of disco as we moved into punk. But it did have value. It did offer value. This, what they call it, wideband Delphi estimation approach, was useful to encourage communication between team members where they hadn't before, to encourage a team-based approach to estimation, which they hadn't done before, and to encourage a relative approach to estimation, which, guess what? They hadn't done before. So using it as a technique to introduce these ideas and concepts in this collaboration in a new team, great idea. Of course, the mistake people made was assuming those cards they used in that game were the most critical thing about it. This game was what we call a scaffold in the world of complexity science. It was a temporary structure to encourage and grow a new set of behaviours and principles. And so after a few weeks, and I think James Grenning, one of the advocates of this right at the start, said his team stopped doing it after a few weeks. After a few weeks or months, we may move on to a different technique, or at least this technique may no longer offer the value it did at the start. And then you can move on to things like, well, sometimes known as affinity estimation or magic estimation, where people tend to keep quiet and just move cards silently on a table. Now, this isn't an estimation lesson, so I don't want to get too sucked into the mechanics of this. But what makes this all interesting for me is what's interesting about this picture. And for me, what's interesting about that picture is that crossover point. How do we spot it? What do we do when we get there? How do we approach that problem? Again, this isn't actually about Nigel graphing this session, so I don't want to deep dive this too much either. But just to give it some thought, think of that crossover point. Think about the symptoms you could spot to note that a method's decaying and perhaps a new one would become valid. And then perhaps think about, as a sophisticated agile person, what you would do in that scenario. And here you can bring in a whole range of other tools into your tool set. Things about coaching stances, for instance. Is this a point where I point that issue out to my team as almost like a consultant? Or do I coach them to help them discover it for themselves? And when they discover it, how best can we solve it? Do we just hard swap from one technique to another? Doesn't sound very agile to me. Do you run experiments? Is this perhaps a moment of hybridization? Planning poker-ish. Perhaps moving into affinity. So there's a whole range of conversations that come up as you start noticing these points of inflection, or these points of change, or these points of choices that can be made. So, because we all love a bit of jargon in this industry, I'm going to call them avergences, stealing the idea from, of course, Star Wars. So let's look at another diagram, this one demonstrating estimation units. Now, for me, this is really fascinating. Why? Because one of the big things at the moment in the agile space has been the demonization of story points. People saying, oh, what a ridiculous idea, this abstract estimation. They don't work for us, they don't work properly. And it's been one of the tools people have used to kind of bash agility in general. But if we look at it through the lens of the Nigel scale and Nigel graphing, we can see that points probably did have a place. They probably do have a place for many teams, but as part of a long-term journey towards better ways of forecasting and estimating their work. So look here, with a new team, and in fact with some old teams, I see it right to this day, people go, they use ideal days. In fact, I see a lot of teams say, oh, we do story points here, Nigel. Every point equals 1 day. Oh my gosh, you're not doing story points. And that's okay, I'm not going to judge. What you're doing is ideal days, okay? And that can actually be a legitimate way to get a team into estimating. An ideal day is an abstraction. It's not a real day. We all know it's not a real day. We all know it's like this mythical, ideal experience that no one's ever had. But it's close to a real day, to be a close stepping stone to get people into the idea of abstract estimation. But we've all been bitten by ideal days so much over the years. In fact, today, just go onto Reddit and read some of the software development groups on Reddit, and you will find people being bitten by ideal day estimates today. So people moved into a more abstract form again, story points, which had validity and helped them. But actually, for the best teams, people move past points. Not to throw away the entire concept of abstract estimating, but just moving into something nearer the no estimates movement, the counting movement, where people go, okay, we've got our items all evenly sized-ish, similarly sized-ish. We can just count how many we do. We don't need to estimate or point them. We just say we do about 10 every iteration or sprint, so we can do about 10 the next sprint. It's really easy, really simple. Conceptually. But of course that journey is far, far harder. But you could use a visualization like this to help you on that journey, to help have the conversations around those divergences, where we should have those conversations, how we should change, and understand that flexibility through maturity and through wisdom and experience, not misunderstanding it. So you can see these graphs being rather powerful. Now this one, I think, it's not really an interesting conversation anymore, but what it set off in my thinking is interesting. So a few years ago, Ron Jeffries, one of the founders of Extreme Programming, now retired, had a bit of a thought experiment. He spent a few articles on his blog discussing what could the future of Agile look like. And I think he jokingly nicknamed it 12, after the Spinal Tap joke of turning the amplifier up to 11. So he imagined, okay, what would one of those the future look like if we turned everything up to 12? And one of the conversations he had was about the product owner role, this product manager role, engaging with teams. And he had a belief that as teams gained in great maturity, what would happen is that role would disappear. That role would be subsumed into the product engineers. They would know all about the product domain and product management domain, and there'll be no need for any separate authority on that topic. And I disagreed with this. I was like, well, I don't agree with this at all. I've got real issues with this because, one, there are aspects, yes, I can imagine going into the team's subject matter expertise for sure. But there are certain things there about budgeting, curation, business engagement that probably does need someone a lot of the time. It's like a core principle in Scrum. But in reality, most product owners, when they start off, are pretty rubbish. If you think of most product owners you work with initially, they're not great at their job. They're not doing a great job. So product owners have to grow into their role. They have to get a certain amount of experience to be able to deliver value in that situation. So that got me into a really interesting conversation in terms of what are we actually tracking here on this time axis? Is it a good synonym for experience or not? So you can see it's not just about getting better. Getting better could actually mean doing things properly. And so, of course, what are we tracking? Are we going from skilled to more skilled? Or is this graph showing us unskilled to skilled? Or is it showing us doing it badly to doing it well? So what I thought I would do is pull out one of those particular conversations. Pull out the conversation about quality of behavior and compare it to value. So not if it's core, good or bad, but what's the value delivered from this, okay, on one axis, compared to the fidelity of the quality of the method being delivered. So not if the method's good or bad, but if that method is being done appropriately or inappropriately. Now, I'll be honest with you, I have done this sort of thing before. About 10, 15 years ago, I did a huge survey using Kano analysis. Not Kano analysis, this is Kano from Mortal Kombat. I did Kano analysis on Scrum, using a large audience, a large survey to get feedback on value here. But value in Kano is in very much one dimension, customer satisfaction or customer delight. So what I wanted to do was keep benefit or value a little bit looser than pure customer satisfaction. So it could mean things like money or savings, etc., just to give us a little bit more flexibility. Now, of course, the interesting thing about Kano analysis is you can have what they call reverse features, where basically, rather than a feature delivering benefit, a feature delivers a loss of benefit or a loss of value, makes the customers unhappy. And so what I've decided to do on this graph is to visualize that as well. Visualize that potentially misuse or less capable use of a method could lead to a loss of value or a loss of benefit. So let's plot Scrum. Now, unfortunately, I can't help you to do that in this particular scenario because this is a pre-recorded video. But I have got some evidence from previous sessions where people have plotted Scrum, and let's see what that tells us. Now, this may look like a random collection of lines, but these were all drawn by attendees in a workshop on the Agile Network. And actually you can see a few distinct patterns in these lines, okay? Pattern number 1, which I think is really interesting, is what I call the linear pattern. This is where they're drawing pretty much a linear straight line from 0 to maximum, showing that Scrum basically add values from day one. And as you get better at doing Scrum, you get more benefit or value released. And this inherently means bad Scrum is better than no Scrum. Right? But then you've got this second grouping down here, the bad Scrum sucks crowd. So they're saying that Scrum done with low quality of behavior could actually be detrimental to the benefit or value of what was the previous status quo. This is actually worse than no Scrum at all. And then we had a few little data points from various people. One person I basically said Scrum sucks, has no value however well you did it. And the final one was quite interesting, was about sort of this exponential curve where you really had to do Scrum to quite a high level of fidelity and quality, but then you get loads and loads of value, And I think what's interesting for me is I've often thought perhaps I was that person saying, you only get value from if you do it really well. But actually, the evidence seems to be showing us in industry that Scrum's quite linear. Like bad Scrum is better than no Scrum. But is that good news or not? So let's go a step further and let's dissect Scrum. Take it into pieces and look at the individual parts. And let's look at the daily Scrum to begin with. Where do you think that should lay on this graph? What profile do you think it would have? Have a think. Linear? Exponential? Starting above the line or below the line? Here's what I think. Now, I'm going to be frank with you. This is not based off of that previous work where I captured loads of these micro narratives to tell a bigger, more subtle story. This is purely vibes-based, but I thought it was interesting. So for me, the daily Scrum's a very interesting tool in that if done improperly, I think can have a real detrimental value on a team experience. In a waterfall or traditional world, if I'm just left alone, I'll get a certain amount of work done. But if people ring me up every morning and expect me to pontificate on how well I'm doing and justify my position, I'm going to find that really hard. I'm going to find it really, really hard. So I think there is a danger with misapplying the daily Scrum to actually make people's lives and value lower. Okay? But I think there's a level of quality of delivery, quality of doing it, where you start delivering positive value. But how much value in terms of customer satisfaction, developer satisfaction, in terms of monetary gain? I think there is a limit on it. I don't necessarily think the daily Scrum is going to be the life-changing experience for many people in terms of Scrum. I think it's going to be one aspect of Scrum that has some value. But just by looking at this profile, so it has a limit on it, if you can tell. But looking at this idea, even if you disagree with this, and I'd love to know what line you would draw, that conversation would be interesting, wouldn't it? To say, okay, right, done poorly, these can be more pain than they're worth. If I can get to a certain level, they will deliver some value. So I need to be quite disciplined and quite rigorous on this particular piece of Scrum. Yet, even a half-baked review can be better than no review at all. So you can see now here where we need strictness, where we need open-mindedness, and where to perhaps focus your efforts in the work. And of course, we could deep dive even further. Now, I am aware there's only so much you can take in one of these talks. So we could dissect down the daily Scrum into like the 3 questions, or how many people are on it. Should we be standing up or not? Should it be remote? Should the PO be there or not? And I think each of these would have an interesting thing to measure. For instance, the Scrum Guide years ago took out some of the advice on daily Scrums, like those 3 questions, kind of took them from Nigel Scale 1, a core practice, into Nigel Scale 2, a good practice, or perhaps Nigel Scale 3, a bad practice. But I don't know if anyone's put the actual intellectual heavy lifting to really look at it in this way and say, okay, but if those 3 questions are done really well, do they offer value? Or is it just conceptually it's wrong? Or perhaps it changes over usage? If they keep trying to make Scrum idiot-proof, and for Agile idiot-proof, they're massively underestimating the ingenuity and ability of idiots. Of people to just screw it up even more. And so there is a need for some practice and some advice in that space. Okay? Now, here's another thing on that conversation, which there's a famous quote, which is, humor is like a frog. When you dissect it, you kill it. So if you look too closely at a joke, sometimes it can ruin the joke. I think there's an element of that in Agile itself, and especially Scrum, in that if you start dissecting it too much, what you could end up with is losing the very life essence that it is. Now, whether that's because these ideas and practices combine in subtle and nuanced ways that people don't realize, especially the principle-led people don't realize, or maybe it's the fact that these simple concepts on their own aren't that simple. They just are deceptively simple. I just don't know yet. But have a think about these practices. Think about the things we just mentioned there. Imagine plotting them on this graph, remote versus oversized versus the 3 questions, and see what you think about this. So in conclusion, I have no idea, but the future looks half-arsed. So can you keep it from being half-baked? Or worse still, just a bit shit? I love this quote by Tom Leher, who died recently. I often feel like a resident of Pompeii who has been asked for some humorous comments on lava. I don't like this half-baked existence, but I think something like this tool could be a very powerful pathway to survival between the methodology clowns and the hybrid jokers. So to wrap it all up, take these 3 points. What people often get wrong is the difference between different and wrong. Understands the difference between natural variance and just getting things wrong. Knowing when to have discipline and rigour around an idea, and knowing when to be open-minded and flexible and try not to confuse the two. And thirdly, remember, confusing a good practice with a core practice is a bad practice. And all those 3 things are happening all over the world of work today. Don't let your hybrid become some sort of vile experience. Try and do the best you can. Now, if you have any further questions, please give me a shout. You can contact me on this phone number here. You can get me on my email. Now, that's my Twitter handle. I don't really tweet much anymore, but you can get me on LinkedIn at Nigel E. Baker. I would love to hear from you. If you have any work or any need for me to come in, give me a shout. I'm available to help. Thank you for watching this episode. I really enjoyed doing it for you, and I hope you've enjoyed it also. And I hope to see you all soon on the next episode of The Age of Uncertainty. Cheers, everyone. Bye.